How do you reconcile God's sovereignty and omniscience with God's regret to make man in Genesis 6:6 and Jonah 3:10 when God changes his mind to destroy them?
All right, well, we just looked at this the other day. Numbers, I think I'm working without a net on some of these, so I could be wrong, but I think it's Numbers 23, verse 19. So someone check me on this. When I throw out a passage, I'm not sure about the reference, but I think it's Numbers chapter 23, verse 19. God says through Balaam, I am not a man that I should lie. And he says, I'm not going to change my mind like a man. So there's places in Scripture where anthropomorphically it says God repented or God changed his mind, but that's only to use language that we can understand. Because the reality is he doesn't have like a plan B. It's always plan A with God. And in order to explain to us what he's doing, he has to use language that we can comprehend. So when it says that God was sorry about making man, he's not saying, oh my goodness, I made a mistake. I've got to, do this or do that to correct it. That was a part of his plan, and why he would start out knowing that he's going to have to start over. Someone someday there's going to be several times tonight I'm going to say, someone's going to have the guts to ask God that question someday, and I'll be standing about 10 feet behind you when you ask. I think a lot of questions we have when we get to heaven, even though no one's going to say anything, we're going to be like, okay, now I understand. But there are questions that people have, and what I can say is I don't understand why God would plan something knowing he's going to start over. It has to be for his glory. That's the final answer on pretty much everything that we don't understand. It glorifies him in some way, and we don't have to always understand exactly how. He's the one who decides what glorifies him. We don't decide, well, that doesn't glorify God, or this does glorify God. If God does something, it's ultimately for his glory. Anything he does is ultimately for his glory. So the final answer on anything is, this glorifies him, and we may scratch our heads and say, I don't see how that glorifies God. Okay, but we don't decide that. He decides that. So anything, any passage, any place where it says God changed his mind, or God regretted, or God was sorry, that doesn't mean the same. It doesn't mean in the same sense that we say, I made a mistake, or I wasn't wise enough, because God is all wise. He never makes a mistake. So ultimately, that was a part of his plan. But when he makes a change from what he was doing to something else, and he says, I'm sorry, it means that God's making a change, and he's trying to explain it to us in a way that we can understand. Now, if we don't accept that, then we end up with something like Greg Boyd, who wrote the book God of the Possible. He's a seminary professor. He's a pastor in Minnesota, a seminary professor, I think, at Bethel. And he wrote the book that basically said, God doesn't know everything until it actually happens. He's learning. He's planned the future in general, but he hasn't planned all the details. And so, if you want to believe that, I think that has a lot more problems than what I just said. And the problem is, in his book, he never deals with Ephesians 1:11, which I would think is verse number 1 you got to deal with, because it says that God is it is God who plans all things according to the counsel of his will. Works all things, I should say, is the exact word. He works all things according to the counsel of his will. You've got to explain that. If you don't explain that verse, you shouldn't even be writing a book at all about God's knowledge of things. But he never touches it. You look in the index. That's the first thing I did, was look in the index, and it's not there. That's your alternatives, but that's where I'd be coming from on this.